Peace, peace, peace. So hope everybody is good today. So we're gonna go ahead and like we normally do, we'll wait for YouTube to alert and send out the notification for it, so everybody knows that we're on. So we kind of can tap into this area of focus uh, that's dealing with the matrix and dark psychology. You can classify with that as well. But it's up under the whole theme that I've been doing, the basis of spirituality. And so when we talk about the basis of spirituality, what we're referring to is when someone begins to entertain the path or they're living in the path, one of the prerequisites, part of your spiritual journey, is to have an understanding of what the world is. Why? Because when you're walking the spiritual path, spiritual journey, you will start to feel some indifference to culture. You might feel some indifference in your previous relationships. You might feel an indifference in some of the things that are advocated socially, simply because you become more mindful, more self aware of yourself. So that means you become more mindful of your, what we refer to as your soul rights, like my soul rights to self love, my soul rights for expression, my soul rights for individuality, my soul rights for preservation, my soul rights for truth, and so on. And so when those are being violated, you have an indifference. Okay. And so that level of awareness begins to birth when you start to really move into your spiritual path. Also, in a broader macro sense, uh, socially speaking, there's certain things constantly being impressed that, again, might not coincide with your soul rights. And so, this is why I encourage everyone's people has been tapping into what I've been doing. The works is one of the books to get that I have is called Soul Rights. You can kind of just click on my YouTube links. You'll see that and go to Soul Rights. And if you join in the Soul House, our Soul House community, that book is already available in there for free for download when you become a member. It's $6 a month. So, and that's in the description, you know, right here. So, when we're talking about the basis of spirituality, is there's a requirement for a level of awareness about yourself and also about the world. And we translate that term world to mean matrix, as we've been bringing out. And so the term world also circles around a term called cosmetics, like the base word that we get in cosmetics we put on makeup. And so that lets us understand that the matrix, the nature of the matrix, is to convince us of things that really is not. And so what I'm going to focus on today is the engineering effect of the matrix, the engineering of deception. Because when you're on a spiritual journey and spiritual path, we're encouraged to what? Not conform to the matrix, not to be enamored by the matrix, to uh, be in the matrix, but not of the matrix. In other words, you don't become one with the matrix. You don't, so you have that level what? Indifference. And so when you start to feel indifference, for example, recently we have been seeing revelations and unfolding from the Senate hearing about misrepresenting to the public in reference to their health. And so it persuaded and convinced massive amount of people in the population globally to partake or to make decisions um, for themselves and their family that they was led to believe one thing, but now we're realizing that they was led to believe not they led to believe one thing when it wasn't fully that what they thought they were believing in. They was told that you take this or do this, you won't catch this. But the reality is, when someone did take this and did this, they still caught this or caught that. And so that's an example of the matrix effect. That's an example of we're referring to the nature of the matrix is that it will present one thing and make you feel and believe it so when it actually really is not. So there's a flippant nature, there's a Jedi mind tricking that goes on inside the matrix. And those that are walking on the spiritual path, whether which route that is, there is a point of understanding where you need to evolve and understand that you have to understand what the matrix is in order to what? Preserve and protect your soul. So we're going to talk about the engineering of deception through the matrix. And so simply put, I will refer to a very common sutra or scripture that a lot of people has heard. It said, you shall know good from evil. So let's understand something about deception. The basis of deception targets knowledge, right? One way to overcome or to not conform to the world is to have something we call is the psychology of truth. Okay. And so a lot of times people just loosely think that knowledge is automatically truth. That's not so. All knowledge is not truth. And so truth has its own prerequisites and its own measurables, and then knowledge. And so the engineering of deception centers around the knowledge of what we know. Notice deception in the engineering deception doesn't revolve around having understanding. Because once you have understanding, you're now in a position to not be inferior to the thing that you're entertaining or that is quote unquote influencing you. You have understanding. So, what the matrix does is it affects and it begins to work to target what we know. And it says, you shall know good from evil. And so, good is referring to a realm of knowledge that is constructive. Constructive for what? Constructive for you and I's soul. This we refer to as the soul rights. Then from evil, so that is destructive um, patterns or knowledge base. So good from evil we refer to as realms. A realm is a domain, a sphere of influence. So what exists in the day-to-day life is at the very basic level is spheres of influence. And under these spheres of influence that we're talking about, spheres of influence of knowledge. One sphere of influence and knowledge facilitates constructive knowledge. So if you get into a pattern of operating constructive knowledge, you start to see results we refer to as good, healthy, sound, prosperous, advancing, uh, enlivening, rejuvenating, all the different expressions that falls in line with that, right? You start to see more quote unquote virtue versus vice. Now, we flip it to the opposite side. When we talk about the realm, there's a realm that facilitates the evil. So, in other words, destructive knowledge, what destructive against what? Against the soul. So it begins to create this. So you get into a pattern of understanding that. You start to work against things of what? The well being of the soul, right? The very first thing when you start to move into a destructive pattern against yourself is not knowing your truth, not understanding the truth. That's why we say to navigate through the world or through the matrix, you must understand the psychology of truth. And that's actually mentioned inside my book, The Base of Spirituality, decoding the matrix. All right. So when you understand that there's these different realms, and so now the world, the matrix is not physical, right? It's more it's a conceptual infrastructure, but it has influence among the people. Okay. And so there's a level of engineering that's constantly going on. And the engineering is more about misconstruing what we know. So that way we begin to see things that are that really is not. And then we call things that are not and we make it seem like that it is. And so I use an example of a good example that we're witnessing right now, in America dealing with the Senate hearing about the massive destruction. Now, the deep thing about it is when people are deceived, it points to something that allowed deception to occur. First of all, deception occurs when there is restricted access to truth. That's why I say there's a difference between knowledge and truth, because the deception cannot gain momentum. This deception cannot have its strength when truth is present, because truth is symbolic of what? Light. Okay. And so when people are operating in dark psychology or operating deception or operating shadows, you know, I guess an unintegrated shadow, there's a natural tendency that they must go against anything that brings light into the situation, right? So, in other words, so from the world aspect, they begin to engineer more destructive knowledge, more self devaluing knowledge, and get people into that rhythm of path. Because once you get into that rhythm of path, you develop that diet of that knowledge base. Now you develop a resistance to the constructive or the more advancing or the more soul stabilizing or the soul enlivening knowledge base. And so what happens is you have this indifference against this, and you start to construct your life around the realm of destructive or self devaluing things that's moving you out of your soul rights, and you begin to structure life around that. This is what we refer to, people start building what? Identities. They start building what? False identities around that. They start having successes or partaking in the realm of referring to as evil. And they don't mind it because we go back to popular scripture that a lot of people hear about, we've heard. And the question is, what should you gain? You gain the whole world, or gain the whole matrix, but yet lose your soul. So the reality is that there's an aspect in human nature that we're willing to expense ourself for the sake of gain. And so because of that, um, that is rooted in human nature. Some act on it and some don't. And then some can be engineered to be more prone to act on it, which occurs. And so then it becomes a normacy inside society. And so now we start to popularize and make it okay or desensitize ourselves for how we're treating each other, because we are all operating under a certain what domain or operative knowledge in the patterns of it. And we're all operating off of self-interest. And so we're constantly interested to have the best what's available in that situation or to position ourselves inside that realm of domain, and ultimately not realizing there's another reality that we could be aligned in and operate in that. And so the basis of spirituality is understanding this, because, like I told before, there's this level of indifference that exists when you are truly, I'm not talking about being religious. I'm not talking about just being devoted to, a ritual or a practice. I'm talking about really moving in the awareness of truth, understanding, and you have a seek for that, and you understanding, you start to love yourself more. When you start to move in that type of path, you're going to start to realize the contradictions that's through the system. You're going to start to realize these uh, perceived incentives, but it's decentivizing yourself for you to sell pieces of yourself. And so when an individual comes to a certain degree of awareness, they begin to see this, begin to understand this. But this is what's encouraged by the wise of the past, the sages and the spiritual advisors and everything, is understand this, because this is what helps sustain your well-being as you move through life. There has to be a level of discernment to understand what's going on in order to what? Self-preserve yourself. So the engineering that goes on through the matrix is to flip the knowledge and to make the destructive knowledge, the devaluing knowledge, to devalue yourself, to see, to appear delightful, to appear to be soothing for you. And so as you begin to enrapture in that, you become more in that, versus the things that builds a soul, that builds up with self autonomy. So deception, we know, is removing of the truth, but when you remove the truth, now it gives another access into the psyche and the soul of the individual. First of all, it blurs their image of themselves. Secondly, it fragments their emotions. So so now the emotions are not aligned. And so typically when you start to see people that has been under heavy deception and start to operate in it, you start to realize, you start to go deeper, you start to realize there is some fragmented with themselves emotionally, because they have to identify emotionally with the things that persuaded them to be operating against their own interest. And then also there is some type of altering of a picture of themselves in certain areas in life, depending on what it is, where that deception is exercised. And so that's what anchors the deception. That's why the worst deception to operate in is self deception. How you know self deception exists? We can look at now. A lot of times, if deception has come to light and we know that deception has occurred, but somehow you're spending time arguing against what has occurred in deception, that means that you hold a high degree of self deception because you're trying to guard and defend the illusion that you operate from to justify why you are in that illusion. Okay. And so all that is the matrix effect. And that's how the engineering of deception occurs, simply by flipping the knowledge, making the destructive, non beneficial, non soul serving knowledge to be more appealing over the knowledge base or the knowledge patterns that is truly soothing, advancing, grounding, and stabilizing for your soul. And so the matrix effect then seeks to build a what? Consensus around it. This is why nations and stuff, they keep what? A consensus of its population. Because the consensus allows them to what? Continue to wedge their what? Power and control. And now they're constantly what? Feeding into the mold. That's what a matrix is, into the mold to keep them inside the Jedi mind flipping. So what they do inside that mold is now they want to get it to be automated. So how you automate this mind flipping, this self altering, this self selling, is that you put in contradictory knowledge in there. You put in fragmented knowledge in there. And then people begin to try to get smart in the fragmented knowledge, no longer not getting the whole knowledge. And what begins to happen is now they begin to recycle that among each other and it begins to spread, spread like a cancer. And so now it becomes what? Self fueling. So now that the system has already put in place to keep people aligned in the delusion, and now they're recycling among each other. And so now that the system, when that's happening, the matrix continues to build its strength and power based off of the consistency of now people constantly conflicting with opinions about certain things. And while that's happening, is they're losing their seek for the truth. And so this is why to navigate through the matrix is to understand and align with the psychology of truth. So that way you can navigate through this. So this is how the engineering of deception occurs through the matrix. All right. So that's what's up. And it's in peace to everybody that's on here. We'll touch back down with more on this. Hey, y'all enjoy y'all's day. One love.